Hello everyone. It's good to see you all here tonight. Thanks very much for coming. Now, we're here to celebrate Australian literature, but also to ask a few questions about whether it's as popular as it really should be. Because, it's hard to imagine that our celebrated contemporary authors like Peter Carey, Tim Winton, Helen Garner, David Malouf, Kate Grenville, being out of print in 10 or 20 years' time. But reading Geordie Williamson's The Burning Library, I was led to think that this was entirely possible because it's happened before. He's assembled a collection of authors whose work isn't very well known these days, and the portrait he paints of our literary heritage is one of neglect. So he asks, how did the likes of Jessica Anderson and Sumner Locke Elliott and Randolph Stowe and Elizabeth Harrower slip off the must-read list? Many of these writers have won Miles Franklin Awards, some multiple times, and one of the authors in the book has won a Nobel. His central question is, as literary fads come and go, are we destined to be in a state of permanent cultural amnesia? Now, before we get into the discussion, I'm Sarah Lestrange and I'm from Books and Arts Daily on ABC RN, Radio National, and all year we ourselves have been holding these monthly book clubs about Australian classics. In fact, Geordie was on the show on the last one talking about Miles Franklin's My Brilliant Career. Now, many of you would have read Geordie's beautiful literary criticism in The Australian, so we're all very lucky to have him here face to face, so please welcome Geordie Williamson. Now, Geordie, I wanted to start by, responding to or asking you about some of the responses to your book. Many professors and lecturers in English departments have commented on your book and they say nothing's wrong. Australian literature is doing well, it's being taught, perhaps not all the books in your list, but it's going fine. How do you respond to that?
Well, the first thing I'm at pains to say in my introduction is that it's not that Australian literature is not being taught. It is being taught. And you can go and check in the Auslan database and see exactly what's being taught, where and when. My concern is our orientation towards the study of Australian literature. And I would argue that there came a moment, some quarter of a century ago, where a change in the way that we taught Australian literature led to a kind of rupture. Now, there were positive aspects to this shake-up. It ventilated what had been a fairly closed canon of Australian works to all kinds of interesting and worthwhile alternative voices.
Geordie, can I just ask, who was on those lists? Who were we reading quarter of a century ago?
Well, I think we talk about that kind of dun-coloured tradition at whose centre was Patrick White. My arbitrary start date for, Auslit is 1938, partly because it neatly leads us up to the bicentenary, and partly because the publication of Capricornia in that year was one of those moments where a book comes along that doesn't look like the book's being published anywhere else. Xavier Herbert is a very problematic figure in our literary history, but I think it's fair to say that there was something strange and excessive and not quite straight down the line about that book, which, looking back, we can now see is unique to a different kind of literature which we might be tempted to call Australian.
So these were the books that were on the list, and then something happened in the universities.
There came a moment, and I have this sort of picture of the wonderful Megan Morris walking into a kind of lecture hall full of old blokes with egg on their tie in combat boots, ready to shake things up. But the turn in Australian universities was something that tended to make a point of kicking away what had come before, those texts which had been associated with what we might call cultural nationalism. And in doing so, it opened the way for all of these other important texts to come forward. My argument is that what we did in that moment was get rid of, kick over the traces of any books that happened to be associated with that earlier moment in Australian literary studies. It was slightly embarrassing, it was dusty, dun-coloured, whatever you have. I don't buy the rupture. I don't buy the argument that we suddenly had history end. I think that those works have a kind of connection with a moment in our history which we now see as white bread and dreary, conservative, inherently masculine, all kinds of negative things. And what I want to do is try and rescue what is still worthwhile about those texts.
I guess when you think about the canon, it is problematic, and I looked up a 2010 study from Auslan of teaching Australian literature in Australia. Very comprehensive, very long. I didn't read it all, I'm just letting you know. But one of the sections was on the canon, and I guess many of the teachers were commenting that it's difficult to present this to students because you might scare them away.
Yeah, there are two kinds of author that I looked at in the Burning Library. There are those figures who are still present on syllabuses at secondary and tertiary levels, figures like White. And then there are figures who have dropped off altogether. Now, the canonical figures, it seemed to me, were worth revisiting, not just because I feel like, all of them are under some kind of pressure or threat, but because a figure like White is taught differently today than he was 30 years ago. Now, I'm sure there are all sorts of sophisticated readings that have been brought to bear on his work in recent years. But if we only keep, say, the Twyburn Affair on a syllabus so that it can be viewed through the prism of, say, studies in gender, then I feel that although that's virtuous, we're losing a sense of the book in the round. And White is somebody who must be read in the round to be understood and appreciated. Stead is another problematic figure who is still written about and hopefully taught more. Certainly Robert Dixon, chair of Auslan at University of Sydney, the first thing he said to me after the book came out was, we're teaching Stead to undergraduates at the University of Sydney. I think that's absolutely brilliant, and I think Robert Dixon is very much on the side of the angels when it comes to trying to teach and preserve Australian literature. The problem arises, I think, from the initial meeting I had with Robert, where I was interviewing him for the Sydney University Alumni magazine when he was taking over from Elizabeth Webby. And I asked point blank, do you think that the theoretical turn in Australian literary studies has been, in the final equation, a good thing or a damaging thing for literary studies? And he said, I think that overall it's been damaging, but we are rebuilding. He said he saw his role, and I think it's one he's performed impeccably, as being curatorial. As I thought about this in subsequent months and years, I kept on coming back to this marvellous essay by Adorno called Valéry Proust's Museum. And one of the arguments that Adorno makes or draws from the work of other European writers is that when we take works out of their context and we place them in a museum, it can be for the best purposes, but it also may be the place where they go to die. When Ken Gelder was writing in defence of the teaching of Australian literature at Australian universities, he said, the people we teach are often on life support. If they weren't taught in the universities, they would die. And I'd rather put it the other way around. the universities, the way they teach is with a sense that perhaps their subjects have already died. Sometimes a lack of faith in the longevity or the enduring value of those that they study, even while the academics who are doing it love their subjects and write brilliantly and teach brilliantly about them.
I guess this raises quite a central issue. I mean, yes, it's important that Australian literature is taught at universities, but many of us have not studied Australian literature at university. And yet there really does seem to be an absence or a neglect within the broader culture towards Australian literature. We had A Mystery of a Hansom Cab on telly the other night, and there are some great movies. My Brilliant Career is one of them. But there does seem to be just this empty hole of Australian literature. That dun-coloured nature has sort of seeped into other parts of culture.
I think what has happened, and this is not the sole responsibility of academia. This is something that publishers have allowed backlists to slide, and we as readers have tended to be habituated to this kind of bubble of the contemporary. We only read what is stacked high now. My own feeling is that I'm uncomfortable with the idea of literary texts being subject to purely market forces. And the bizarre thing is, when I start looking for the culprits, where the market forces are in operation, they're absolutely everywhere. What I try and talk about in the book is a kind of pincer movement that took place where our literature was effectively privatised. Now, in one respect, it was privatised because with the more theoretical turn of Australian literary studies, the discussion of literature involved specialist language and was directed towards journals that were read by small communities. Now, I completely understand that the advanced study in any field involves specialisation. It may involve specialist language. But at the same time that the theoretical turn was creating this turn away from wider public dissemination of literature, you had the politicians making this unprecedented intrusion into the fabric of university life and the way that universities were run. So on one hand, you have students who once had the leisure to actually sit around and read, now being obliged to work part-time jobs, to watch their lectures remotely on their laptops. They no longer created the kind of networks of like-minded readers that kind of preserve culture outside the academy once they've graduated. And on the other, you have a turning away from outlets that in the past you would perhaps have town and gown academics who were happy to take what they had learned out to the general public and try and communicate it to those educated, engaged students who no longer exist amongst our younger generation of undergraduates. So once literature is privatised, it is operating purely under market forces. And what I would submit to you is that literary texts partake of a gift economy. They are not like a BMW that instantly loses a portion of its value the minute you drive it off the lot. Rather, the broadest possible circulation of a text of value only increases the more widely it appears. So the argument that Lewis Hyde, who first puts forward this argument in a wonderful book called The Gift, suggests that a play by Shakespeare, each time it is reproduced, performed, reprinted, actually increases the cultural value of that text. So what I'm venturing to do here is to make an argument that we've gone too far one way in terms of the dissemination of text. And without that wider distribution of text to an educated and engaged and interested public, we're in trouble, because what you have then is isolated communities of scholars speaking only amongst themselves as kind of, in the midst of a great darkness. And we remember when that was when monks sat shivering in their stone buildings while all around them culture just disappeared. I'm not saying it's a new dark ages, but I'm saying this is how they occur, where culture retreats into a tiny point and is not linked to any wider social structure.
Well, and I guess Australian literature and literature in general is competing with the saturation media that is out there, all of the different ways we can entertain ourselves, many of which don't include reading books. And this is one of the ideas of the burning library. So one sense of the burning library is that it's in embers. The other sense is this electrifying nature, that we can sort of put electricity back into it, re-energise it.
Well, I think, the transmission to digital has been, one of these great upheavals, and it creates all kinds of pressures. One of the joys of this moment is that once we've overcome some legal and logistical barriers, it may well be possible that we can have access to many texts that have hitherto been really hard to track down, for undergraduates, for academics to use, for people to read outside the bubble of just reading the book that's been published this week. And that is a great boon. But I think the problem of a reading culture trying to preserve itself in the midst of all of these unprecedented alternatives is something that it doesn't matter whether it's Australian literature, it's any kind of literature, and we all know that it flattens our experience. I, for one, have found the way that I read over recent years has really shifted. I skid across the surface of a text in a way that I don't think I used to do. And I think it takes a conscious effort to return to the analogue for now and then, just to reconnect with that older way of reading.
I'm still in that older way of reading, I have to admit.
Hold on to it.
I'm a very late adopter. But reading Geordie's book, I set out to read some of the books that he talks about, and I mean some that he doesn't as well, but by authors that I would never really have thought of reading. For instance, this might sound scandalous, but I'd never thought of reading Thomas Keneally because he's so ubiquitous. I never thought that there would ever need to be a time. And yet then I read The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, and I'm just blown away. My goodness, what a text, what a story. This is electrifying. This is world literature, I think. I think that really is up there. And same with Christina Stead, The Man Who Loved Children. When I read that for Books and Arts Daily's book club, and that just blew me out of the water again, because her writing is she's just like she's a steam engine. She's just chugging away. In fact, her language is something that I've never experienced before. These are the discoveries we can make when we go off the beaten track.
Well, Keneally's interesting. He's another author who you could say, look, he is publicly visible, he's in print, and what's the problem? I think looking at Keneally's work, I suddenly got the sense that we tend to read him. He's a victim of his own, in industry. He publishes so regularly, and what he writes is obviously engaging in the moment, that you might suspect that he is editorialising and not perhaps a kind of a major author in the way that we might treat someone like Malouf, who publishes less often, and when he does, it's always a great event. But to go back and look at Keneally and to take the long view is a remarkable thing. For one thing, His early works are brilliant in and of themselves. They are far more consciously wrought as aesthetic artefacts than his later works. They can be enjoyed in their own right, and I don't think they've lost anything. And I think that he's a great interrogator, a gentle but fearless interrogator of many aspects of our culture that we do not wish to see.
What do you mean by gentle? Because Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith is not gentle.
This is fair to say. What I would say is that when he sets out he always finds a way, if not in the text specifically, but in, say, a subsequent text, to draw the sting of some other thrust that he has made. And in that, I think that he is generally a gentle man. But when we start looking at Keneally through the prism of his entire career, something happens. He is no longer the kind of ubiquitous editorialiser that we enjoy and then only get to every third book. He's actually undertaking a larger project which can only be seen in its totality. Having read a number now of his early works, I won't pretend that I've been through the entire back catalogue, but I've come to agree with Peter Pearce when he says, Keneally is our Zola, he is our Balzac, he is writing our human comedy. We do not know this unless we take the opportunity to read back, to read more completely. And that's the argument I would love to make about his work. There is a golden thread running through it, and it is quite extraordinary taken as a whole.
A lot of the books that I've read have been actually quite brutal in different ways. So we've got Christina Said's A Man Who Loves Children, about this incredible family that I'm so glad I'm not part of. And then we've got Elizabeth Harrower, another claustrophobic brutality, sort of focusing on women in the 50s. Women's contribution has been quite distinctive, and the women that you represent in this book really seem to be of a kind in a way. Certainly the ones who published later have something else to bring. Do you want to talk about that, the different...
I think that what I realised as I started doing work on this book was that there was one tradition in early 20th century Auslit which was a bit of a dead end, and that was the explicitly nationalist, masculinist, frontier-obsessed novel. I went back to, say, people like Frank Dalby Davison to see how he'd stood up. And while I think there are some lovely short stories, I found myself falling over at The White Thorn Tree, which was 20 years in the writing and some 850 pages long. It's the women who survive. And what happened was they were writing about the subjects which were not necessarily valorised by the Bulletin Circle and those who came after. And I do agree with those academics who point to a gendering of those kind of the core values of Auslit in the early decades of the 20th century. It's a happy accident that the book opens with an essay on M. Barnard Eldershaw, who, as a literary collaboration, seem to have cancelled each other out. Marjorie Barnard and Flora Eldershaw are really they're not taught, as far as I'm aware, at Australian universities, although Marjorie Barnard's short stories, I think, are taught at the University of Queensland. But together, their novels are absolutely crucial to the idea of an alternative vision of what Australian literature could be. They're beautifully written, they're angry, they're incredibly intelligent, and a book like Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which, as far as I can see, has kept all of its energy and all of its vigour right up to now. I say it could be the local Bible of the Occupy movement. It's so vivid in its anger against what it sees as corporate malfeasance and human greed. And yet these books are out of print and virtually these women are unread.
So, Geordie, I think everyone would like to know how broadly you read for this project.
I have always been...
Paint the landscape for us.
Well, Michael Hayward called me late last year and said, would you be up for writing a book about Australian literature? And it took
So
me
Michael Hayward from Text Publishing.
Sorry, yes. And it was just this very generous, lovely, terrifyingly open offer. So I started reading furiously in every direction I could. And if you turn to the end of my book, I had this sort of suggested further reading list, which is absolutely bonkers in its eccentricity. I've got Sandy Stone's monologues beside Geoffrey Blaney's first books, The Peaks of Lyell. I have short stories beside explorers' journals. I really don't believe in hard and fast distinctions between what, it is not fiction alone that seems to be virtuous in our tradition. And in fact, I think our obsession with the novel perhaps lets us down. I'm not sure after writing this book that the novel is necessarily where it's at for us. I have come to understand that the yarn, as people before me have pointed out, may well be a literary tradition that we think is expended, but in fact is our local indigenous literary tradition.
Where did you find that?
Well,
what sort of examples?
The yarn, right? Well, Dal Stivens, who probably was the hardest sell in the book, to go back and look at his writing. He's out of print, except for one print-on-demand title from the University of Sydney. He didn't make it into the Penn Macquarie Anthology of Australian Lit.
Which is a huge book.
Which is a vast tome published in, I think, 2009. There was meant to be a comprehensive account of all that's worth recalling in Australian literature from 1788 to the present. The anthology is a beautiful book, put together by splendid scholars. It is filled with treasures. But for me, personally, there were omissions and glaring ones. And when you look into the back of this book and find that Dal Stivens is not there, nor is Elizabeth Harrower, nor is Amy Whiting, nor are a number of other significant figures, you have to ask yourself, what's wrong with these writers? When it came to Stivens, I thought that it was his subject matter, which was, he starts out as a kind of social realist during the Depression years in the kind of American Theodore Dreiser model. Lots of small town grotesques and hopping freight trains. They're quite beautiful, I think, those stories. They're stark, like sort of Neil Cunahan paintings. He then turns to the bush yarn, and nobody is interested in the bush yarn. There's nothing dustier, there's nothing less sexy, I would argue, in our literature. And yet what he brings to the bush yarn are the stylistic and psychological expansions of modernism. We all read, or some of us hopefully read, Italo Calvino's Italian folk tales and can see that he is not only reproducing in a Volkish way the old stories of his people, but rather he is altering them and showing that they are not static, they are not dead, but rather they are fresh iterations of a living culture. I think Stivens was trying to do that, and I relish his stories for their humour and for their strangeness, which is just that little bit more weird than it needs to be. His novel, which I concentrate on in the essay, in that particular essay, is A Horse of Air, which won the Miles Franklin in 1970. I think it's a marvellous novel and a very strange one, because it starts off as a very sort of urbane and sophisticated comedy of manners. And about halfway through the book leaves Sydney and the society that inhabits it and goes into the heart of the country, into the desert. the protagonist of the novel goes in search of the rare night parrot. What happens as soon as the novel enters the heart of the country is something that rocks it quite out of its cradle. It stops being a novel at that point, I would argue, and becomes a kind of prose poem of place, a deep history of the region, a meditation, and the beauty of those passages are quite unlike anything that Stevens has done before. I came out of that book thinking that here was a man who had perhaps not managed to articulate for himself something that he was grasping towards, but it's there, and we can see it, and we can link it to a number of other place-bound writings of more recent vintage that also strike us more as celebrations, rhapsodic celebrations of place than strict novels. And I think of, the work of Eric Rolls, for instance, who we don't think of as a creative writer, but as a non-fiction writer. So there are traditions there, but I think perhaps we're drawing the walls between genres in the wrong places.
Did you grow up with the sense that you should be reading Australian literature, or that you want to be reading Australian literature? Was that something that you were compelled to do?
It wasn't about the house where I grew up. We weren't a bookish family. My father had come out as a jackaroo in the 60s, and his first station he'd worked for Banjo Patterson's son. And so he had this kind of fondness for Patterson. And apart from the fact that I grew up in the town, Grenfell, where Henry Lawson was born, I really found these figures very boring. In fact, I found my entire childhood, apart from the fact that it was beautiful country around me and I responded to that, I found it dull as all giddy up. And as soon as I had the chance, I went and lived in cities, and I never read Australian literature except for Patrick White, who I sort of granted a grudging world lit status to. I read English contemporary fiction and 20th century fiction. I read American novels. I read European literature in translation and thought I was very sophisticated for doing so. And it was only after years of living in the UK and finding myself incredibly homesick that I was living in the West Country in Lyme Regis, and there was a lovely little bookshop just at the base of the Cobb, tiny but just stacked with great old paperbacks, very cheap. And I found a copy of Martin Boyd's The Cardboard Crown, and I took it up to the undercliff above Lyme Regis, which people may remember from The French Lieutenant's Woman, this beautiful view. And I started reading it, and the reaction was quite visceral. I realised that he was a man articulating my own sense of cultural confusion, my own homelessness, and it really got me in the solar plexus. And so after that, I decided that perhaps I'd been wrong, and so in the tradition of slow learners everywhere, I started to make up for lost time. But I'd say that my reading in Australian literature is still full of holes. There's so much I haven't read, and this book only really embarrassed me with the thinness of my knowledge of our tradition. This is not a scholarly book. It doesn't pretend to be so. It leans a lot on really smart people who have written very well and with insight about a number of the subjects that I've discussed. But my sincere hope is the only virtue that the book will hold is if people read it and then say, wow, that Olga Masters sounds okay, I might go out and read a few of her short stories. And if I've done that, then I've done my job.
And this idea of place, you coming across a book that takes you or transports you in a way, is that a way to reimagine or move away from the cultural nationalism, which is so out of favour, to imagine that we're reading, or to read these books as an insight into place? That there's something very distinctive about reading Ruth Park or many of these writers on your list that tells us something about ourselves, which is not about nationalism.
Well, this is why it's an unfortunate thing that so many of our writers got tied up with the idea of nationhood. So a figure like Miles Franklin, having to look again at my brilliant career for the RN Book Club the other day, was just such an astonishment. The vigour, the liveliness of the language, there's an electric presence. I think that she managed to read a lot of the better kind of 19th century literature and managed to absorb a bit of Dickensian energy and bounce to her prose. But at the same time, we think of Miles Franklin in uncomfortable ways because she's so tied up with the project of cultural nationalism. Now, for us today, nationalism is an uncomfortable thing. I sit on my train going down from the Blue Mountains to Sydney, and one day the guy came through and he had a shaved head and he was wearing a Southern Cross hoodie. And I thought, here is a flag, here is a national symbol, and yet the way this is going together makes me feel deeply uncomfortable. And I know that English people feel the same kind of anxiety, low level, that you see when you see a football supporter wearing a flag of St George. It's almost as if nationalism is something that has been distributed down through the social chain and is now the preserve of an aggrieved class within a globalised, wealthy middle class, which likes to see itself as belonging to no place in particular. We're essentially urban, and we like to read books that reflect our own experience of place. But what I'd argue is that the way around this problem of either being increasingly transnational citizens who see the world as one vast non-place, where all the specificity, whether that's cultural or physical, geographic, falls away, and it's just a series of chain stores of the soul, that seems to me a negative thing for all of its virtues, for all that it allows us to rub along as a polyglot, multicultural society, that we can't just turn and back and say, all right, well, what we need to do now is reject that and return to a kind of what Jeff Sparrow calls a zombie nationalism. Rather, we have to find a way around. For me, reading these books, it seemed to me that if we look at Australia not as a legal and political construct, but rather as a very large island within which are many regions, each utterly distinct, each which one day may map on to older notions of indigenous nationhood, because we are shaped by the landscape as much as we shape it. That if we could return to an idea of place as a way of seeing value in older works of Australian literature, then we might be getting on the right track. Because the degree to which our sense of place outside our own urban spaces is erased from the culture is the degree to which outside forces can exploit or despoil them. I think of the Pellagra Scrub region, the forest that Eric Rolls described in his great work, A Million Wild Acres. And that is a place right now where the water is bubbling with methane from coal seam gas fracking. So the degree to which we turn away from a place because it seems to us to be the storehouse of everything that we fought to get away from to become globalised moderns is really opening a door to allow others to come and do to it what they will, or sell us on false or idealised versions of that place. So This does not mean that we cannot have a cosmopolitan literature. It just means that attending to place has its own virtues and its own worth, quite aside from the pleasures to be had from revisiting these, excellent or exemplary literary texts from our past.
Now, we're going to be coming to questions soon, so please think of some. Before we go there, I just wanted to, round things off a little bit and think about, well, there are these reminders of our literary heritage. So on Books and Arts, as I said, we do the monthly book club. Wheeler Centre's been doing sessions all year. Meanjin did its own female novelist tournament last year. They're doing a short story tournament this year. Publishers dabble in the classics, that sort of thing. So there are these attempts. What's going to give it that final oomph to keep things going?
I think the idea of an holistic approach. I'd really like to see our orientation towards reading become one of the subversive pleasure of reading. I note today that, I used to walk out of my inner Western Sydney home and find somebody had gone guerrilla gardening during the night and planted our median strip. And the thought gave me such pleasure. The whole idea of the slow food movement, it seems to me, is something that is pretty unique in our day, and that is the idea that a progressive or leftist politics could emerge from simple pleasures, that it might be fun rather than what it was for most of the 20th century, which was doctrinaire. So I think that the one thing that would keep Auslan alive, and I know that we tend to do these things in phases, we see crisis and we call it, and yet that condition of crisis seems to be the one stable thing that runs through our discussion of our literature. But if we could read with the sense that the very pleasure we took was in itself subversive, was in its own way a kind of dig at the status quo, then we might feel it less of a kind of citizen's obligation and more as just one of life's real pleasures.
Hear, hear. So, questions, please come forth.
Fantastic talk. They're extremely hard to find, some of these books that you've mentioned. I've tried, and who knows where you can dig them up? I don't.
Thank you, Chong. I should out Chong as the designer
From
of the
text,
cover
I believe, is the answer.
of my beautiful book, which is just the most fantastic cover, and changed my opinion of what I'd been trying to do, because instead of burning the books, as I'd presume he would and had been in my mind, he irradiated them. And it makes me think of the Geiger counter ticking, that there's a half-life in all of these books, which seems to be a much more lively and vigorous way to look at them. So in answer to your question, I use a lot of second-hand bookshops and was just acquisitive. But as a clearinghouse and as a long-time seller of rare books, I would point you towards abe.com. It's where I got so many of the editions that I needed to get. It's not necessarily a cheap thing to do, because so many of these books don't go into second editions. So, for instance, Jessica Anderson's The Commandant is available only in a first edition. So is Amy Whitting's first novel. That said, in many other instances, you can pick up very reasonably paperback editions in perfectly good nick of these books, and they can be on your doorstep in moments. For the older books, not wanting to put the publishers out of business, go to Gutenberg.org if you have a digital device of some kind, and there is a whole treasury of 19th and early 20th century literature which is available for free.
Other questions?
As you're also from being published by Text, I was wondering what you thought of Text Classics. And I'm afraid, as you mentioned, Jessica Adams' Commandant is published by the Text Classics as well. and this would be a good way of getting a lot of access to these books. And I was wondering what you thought about that, because you hadn't mentioned it.
Right. Well, I mean, I think. Thank you. That is an important question, because probably the one anxiety I had about undertaking this book, and I knew at the time what Michael was planning, because he told me from the get-go. In isolation, I think it is an absolutely splendid and worthy undertaking. I think that the introductions are great. I wrote 2 of them myself. They're probably the 2 of the less interesting ones, but many of the others have entirely reinvigorated my sense of why that book is worthwhile, why it's been forgotten, and why I want to read it again now. But my fear writing the book personally was that I didn't want to be writing advertorial for an imprint. And what I would thank Michael Hayward and Text for greatly is that they literally discouraged me from writing too closely from what they were doing. And where there has been crossover, it was because Michael would read a chapter and say, "Really? This book is good? Should we get someone? Should we do this?" And that sense of absolute enthusiasm. I knew that I was giving him a decent chapter if he sounded like he wanted to go out and republish it. So yeah, there was some nice serendipitous connections, but I was really determined to try and write about books that weren't necessarily ever going to appear on the Text Classic list, although I'd be really happy if all of them did.
Do you think we're more confident now with our approach to literature? Certainly with our contemporary literature, can you imagine it having a better afterlife than the books that you talk about?
Oh, it's really hard to say. When we're inside the maelstrom of the contemporary and all of these forces in play. I often, because my job is to read a lot of new Australian fiction and to respond to it, and I feel like the books that I praised 5 years ago are already fading out of my memory. And then perhaps books that I liked but probably didn't rave about have stayed with me for all kinds of weird reasons. And I wonder if that's the difference between the initial ignition. And Walter Benjamin has these beautiful images for the way that books are received by readers. And for most books, it's like the lighting of a match. But for other books, it's like setting a fuse. The ignition is long and they throw off these sparks. For instance, there is one book that I was talking to students about this afternoon, and I'm sorry, this is not a text advertorial. It originally went via Allen and Unwin, who ridiculously turned it down. But it was a book called The Vintage and the Gleaning by a young man named Jeremy Chambers. And it's set in a small wine area town on the New South Wales Victorian border. And as a picture of kind of post-millennial rural Australia, its narrowed horizons, its lengthening shadows, it just stays with me. And I feel, having finished this book, that books like it, that were unexpected and didn't literally sit on, weren't on my radar 3 years ago when I reviewed it, may yet come to the fore in years to come.
I just had a quick question. Thinking about culture, do you think that the Australian film industry has mirrored what's happened with books to some extent?
Did everyone hear that? No.
I'll repeat the question because it's a really good one. The gentleman is asking whether I see a reflection in what has happened with books in the Australian film industry. And it's not an area that I am as familiar with, but I imagine, and I know a few people who are involved in the industry, and they would say that the kind of our funding models tend to encourage certain kinds of films, that the Australian film industry has the same problem of you can always get funding to make your first film, and then after that life becomes far more difficult. In publishing now, you can get your first book out, but if that doesn't crack it, then there aren't many second chances. I think there's also been a retreat from the idea of rural or non-urban narratives, although it's interesting how maybe a few make it through the back door through, say, the genre of the Gothic. If we look at, say, some of the more, road movies or westerns that have been made in recent years, I would say that there is certainly a mirroring of a kind of loss of confidence in the idea of a film reflecting Australian life. Rather, there is an eye on the international market always. It needs to be made in such a way that it could operate simultaneously in various different areas. That's the transnational. And when you go to get research funding for your projects as an academic in Australian universities, it's better to go for a subject that has some wider, say, post-colonial significance rather than going for a specific Australian subject, because you're painting yourself into a corner. And in that way, even when we think we're doing impeccable kind of new work in an area, all we're doing is replicating the demands of the marketplace.
So do you think it's sort of as parochialism?
What is it? I think it's a kind of inverted parochialism. It's a sense that we must, under the current market conditions, we must be global. We must appeal globally.
Sorry, that's what I mean.
And I think what that robs us of is the very thing that often made Australian films attractive to international audiences. I'd argue that you don't try and appeal to a global audience with something which doesn't seem to have its feet planted on the ground. I'd say an absolute return to localism in the making of films might be the way to actually intrigue people from other places, but we don't get that, and in film or in literature. And I guess, in a sense, I'm not interested in cultural nationalism as a strutting about the world. I'm interested in as a revelation of the local and the regional and their differences. This is a very big country with a lot of, as Kim Scott told me one day when I was trying to speak, monolithically about Indigenous Australia, he said, there is no Indigenous Australia. There are hundreds of Indigenous nations. And I imagine that it's part of our project and our obligation as latecomers here to actually investigate closely why that was the case.
Questions? More questions? If you don't have a question, perhaps you could suggest some books for the reading list as well.
Just this year I attended the Wheeler Centre's series of lectures for the Year 12 students in their English and literature programs, and they were brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And some of those audiences included perhaps larger numbers of people my age, I won't say what that is, but it's senior, than there were the Year 12 students themselves. And I guess I have a regret that so many students get selected out of English literature, and I wondered whether you thought that's not where we should be planting the seeds.
My stepson is just about to turn 16, and he's had to, in the previous months, make some hard and fast decisions about what subjects he was going to study for his HSC. And he's a great reader, and it was an awful thing to sit there and think, I want to encourage you to do as much English as you can, while thinking you can crunch the numbers in other subjects. You're a smart kid. You can up your grades. You can maximise your utility, your capacity. And I imagine that's probably behind the attitudes of many parents going through, because it's not enough that we educate our children. They must succeed. They must get the appropriate marks. Otherwise, they can't go forward. The worst thing that happened during to me in my academic life was the weighted moving average. When I first was an undergraduate, and it shames me to tell you this, I failed quite a lot of my first BA.
No.
I was reading off the reservation. I didn't want to read what they told me I should read. I'm only just getting back now to Chaucer and realising how much I missed. But today, students who tried to do what I did, wasting time in the most fruitful way possible, would not be able to do it because every mark counts towards your eventual degree. I would not have ever managed to get a first-class honours degree or go on to postgraduate study had I, goofed off and read off the reservation for those years. So I think that children are being urged out of subjects such as English literature because they cannot be quantified so easily, and there is a fear on the part of the community generally that their kids will drift. And I hate the idea that a love of books and a familiarity with just some exemplary books is not something which is seen as a virtue in and of itself, quite aside from Marx.
One last question. I'm sure there's one out there. Yes, we have a winner.
Geordie, you are a great reflector of human nature. Are you taunted by the thought that we all have the same faults and failings and we're only unique as we vary our virtues?
I think this, that lovely statement or question, I'm not quite sure which it is reflected in the very act of reading imaginative fiction, that there is a profound, I don't want to get too metaphysical about this, but there is a profound sadness often in the way that we move through the world, a sense of separation. And working on my chapter on Randolph Stowe, who I think is the most melancholy of Australian authors and who I do believe is my great favourite, he spoke about this idea of our understanding of self not being about a kind of agglomeration of our successes or social contacts in the public realm, but rather the history of our acknowledgements of our isolation from others. What I seek in fiction is the consolation of that narrow-band communication between one mind and another, which, while it confirms me in my loneliness, allows me to share in the loneliness of another. And that kind of communion seems to me to be the finest thing that the act of reading can offer us. And it is why I agree with the wonderful American novelist Richard Powers, who in a Paris Review interview a few years back said that reading is the last secular act of prayer. And we don't always read like that, and not every book is going to provide that. But when we look back over the books that have really counted in our lives, I'd hope that occasionally you have that feeling.
What a beautiful place to end. Well, I urge you all to rush out and get your hands on some electrifying and sometimes searing Australian literature. Now, Brunswick Street Bookstore has set up shop at the entrance tonight, and Geordie will be signing his book, The Burning Library. So please now join me in thanking Geordie Williamson.
Can we also thank Sarah, who came here, and she didn't tell me first, but she's 22 weeks pregnant, so it's been slightly uncomfortable for her the whole way through.
Hasn't been at all. Thank you.